Don't bullshit me.
Now here comes an excellent part that's going to explain something to a lot of people, like Tenebraust, Anti-Terrorist, and some of the others. Listen to this closely. The measure had failed in Congress after the most strenuous efforts to carry it by Hamilton and consolidationists against the united opposition of the South. The South was the Confederacy then. It lacked 2 votes in the House of Representatives to give it a majority. Hamilton proposed to Jefferson that he should get these 2 votes from Virginia to carry the measure, and promised that he would get a sufficient number of votes from the creditor states to remove the capital to the Potomac. Again, creditor states. Everybody outside the original 13 and the split within the 13 on the South made the South Confederates. Confederacy. They were not the originators or creators of the Constitution. Whoever created that were the creditors. They designed that. Okay. Anybody signing on after that was a debtor anyway. You know that. The bargain was carried out. Jefferson got Mr. Lee and White, representatives in Congress from Virginia, to vote for the bill, assuming the debts of the states. And Hamilton got the necessary votes from the North to pass a bill to place the capital on the Potomac. Now, Mr. Jefferson says, let me throw this in there, money, not morality, is the principal commerce of civilized nations. Yeah, he was so against the bank, he wasn't at all. The biographer of Jefferson states that the reason employed by Hamilton to induce Jefferson to commit this gross delinquency, which he ever after deplored as the greatest error in his life, was that if this measure should not pass, there was great danger of a secession of the members of Congress from the creditor states, which would end in the separation of the states. Jefferson had returned from Europe to assume his position as Secretary of State in General Washington's cabinet, and therefore knew nothing of the temper of Congress. In order to palliate, not justify, his conduct on this occasion, and to show the force of the reason employed by Hamilton to influence Jefferson, and to bring General Washington also into support of the step, as well as his other measures of consolidation, it is necessary to go back a few steps in the history of the times. The creditor states spoken of by Hamilton to Jefferson were the New England states. It was these states whom Hamilton urged would secede and break up the Union unless their debts were assumed by the government of the United States, which means it would pass to the South, and they would have to pay it off. And yet the debt itself was a farce. Think of this. Okay, and the South was saying, no thank you, it's a scam. The New England people had suffered very little compared with the other states during the Revolutionary War of 76. The enemy had not ravaged that country as they had South Carolina. They had set fire to only 1 or 2 towns on their coast. They were in New England with an army at but one spot, Boston. And whilst there, they did not plunder the people to support the army. What supplies they did not bring with them, they purchased from the people of New England. Yes. Note, for more clarification, read Pennsylvania Archives, Volume 7 by Sam Hazard, 1853, specifically page 405 in a letter, Carruthers to Reed, 1779. General Washington's army did the same for the brief time it was in New England, and the unscrupulous greed the people manifested in making money out of the army was denounced by him in no measured terms. The assertion of Mr. Webster that the bones of the people of New England fallen in battle were scattered from Maine to Georgia was a figure of rhetoric unworthy of the most ignorant declaimer. Now, let me throw in again the Pennsylvania Archives. Page 392, Memorial of the 1st Company of the Philadelphia Militia Artillery, 1779, as well as Shays' Rebellion. Okay, let me throw that in there because what did they do? They went off to go fight people way, way away, and then they come back and everybody had took over their stuff. And they lost all their stuff. Yes. There was not a single regiment of troops from New England during the whole war in South or North Carolina. The people of New England suffered doubtless with all the rest of the United States in the evils common to all of a war of 7 years' duration, yet they were the only people in the United States who seemed to be incapable of understanding the value of the independence they had achieved. I will disagree, especially with Shay, but remember that he's wanting to argue North versus South. All right, he's not talking about the little man, us. Okay. Whilst Virginia, the leading southern state, was engaged in the effort peacefully to adjust the defects of the government of the Confederacy and to meet the difficulties and troubles inseparable from the war, first by calling the convention at Annapolis, and afterward by proposing a convention of all the states to meet at Philadelphia. New England was rapidly lapsing into anarchy and despotism. Like, again, he's trying to get a bunch of stuff started here when all it was corporations, and Washington and his buddies, they set the system up and scammed the system under the Articles of Confederation, and it was loose enough that it got so bad that little men like Shay said, no, we're going to go ahead and kill everybody. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden we needed the Constitution then, right? Yes. And then Sam Adams and the Riot Act, all these so-called patriots, yeah. Anyway, she sent no delegates to Annapolis, nor is it certain she would have sent any to Philadelphia. Okay, had it not been for the revolutionary turbulence which alarmed all persons possessing property. Okay, because you had a problem with Shay and them going, whoa, this is a scam. All my stuff's gone. Where was it? Doors. Yeah, a whole bunch of those people, they lost their stuff for no reason other than a bunch of scam artists were scamming them, so they decided they were going to go start stringing people up. And then all of a sudden, the people with the property says, get the corporations to hire armies. United States government, we need your help. Because then Washington and Jefferson and the others were scared. Okay. The people broke out into insurrection in Massachusetts, both against the government of the state and that of the Confederacy. See, how much clearer can you get it, kids? The state was the North, the United States. The Confederacy was the South. Those were the ones that did not join in the Constitution. And the Civil War was to bring them under it in force. Okay? Anyway, and it is curious to see how the disregard of constitutional obligations, which they have ever since manifested, was displayed. But again, he's holding up the South and the Constitution, ignoring, obviously, that the South was a Confederacy. All right? While he upholds those who own it should govern it. All right? This disorderly spirit, says Marshall, was cherished by unlicensed conventions. Now, this is what I love about Marshall saying this. He was mad because even though they did unlicensed conventions to start the revolution, it was not okay for you to do it. Which, after voting their own constitutionality, right, you got together and said, we're constitutional because you said you were. So we can do it too. And assuming the name of the people. Now remember, he's griping about them assuming the name of the people, but he's not griping about the originals doing it. Arrayed themselves against the legislature and detailed the grievances by which they alleged themselves oppressed. Its hostility was principally directed against the compensation promised to the officers of the army, against taxes. Yeah, taxes that never existed, and all of a sudden now it was individual taxing. Boom, here you go. Do it now. And against the administration of justice. That's right. Salente took that from me, and I'll give it back to Salente. Justice is just us. and the circulation of a depreciated paper currency was required as a relief from the pressure of public and private burdens, which had become, it was alleged, too heavy to be borne. And it was. It was. The corporations waited till you left, took everything over, and then taxed you for it. Because they were your government now. Your state governments. That's the beauty of it. Now, evidently Marshall wasn't starving or having corporations take his stuff. His kind never do. Special attention should be paid to the phrase unlicensed conventions, because you are not allowed to represent yourself as a mere non-citizen or merely presumptive one of the corporations. Also, the next phrase, assuming the name of the people. Now, why exactly would he say, assuming the name of the people? Isn't this your government? But they could. That's right. Patrick Henry said, who are you to assume the name? And then they get mad at you when you do it. For God's sake, tell me, said Washington in a letter to Colonel Humphreys, what is the cause of these commotions? Do they proceed from licentiousness, British influence disseminated by Tories, or real grievances which admit of redress? Colonel Humphreys replied, from all three of these causes you have suggested. General Knox, then Secretary of War under the Confederacy, after returning from a visit to New England, which was made to ascertain the true state of things, says in a letter to General Washington, it is indeed a fact that high taxes are the ostensible cause of the commotion, but that they are the real cause is as far remote from the truth as light is from darkness. The people who are the insurgents have never paid any or but very little taxes. Now, let me throw this in while this smart ass is telling him this. What is his taxes like? If you're a multimillionaire, the fuck is $100,000 to you, Ron Paul, or any of the others? You, the little man, if you pay any taxes, it's a burden. You're paying taxes so they can be rich. That's what I'm saying. Being broke will make you want to start a revolution. And these idiots at the top are only there to stroke their own egos and to keep the system rolling. All right? Walk away. Make them go get a real job. Make them starve like you do. But they feel their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force. And they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. And you can't, now let me throw in, you can't do that. That's not right. That's not right. Now, it's okay for Washington to do that. In fact, it was okay for Washington to use you as cannon fodder, then turn around and fuck you out of your pay. That was completely acceptable. Okay? Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscation by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be common to all. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice, not to be swept from the face of the earth. Now again, you see, the founders and the wealthy made certain you were still broke under them. All right? And you're not allowed to claim the commonality of something that you protected with your life while they made certain to win and keep all the money. That's right. That's right. You're not allowed to do that. So, I'm going to throw this in for Jonesy and the others, and I love this quote, and it proves how full of shit these people are. Gorgeous George Washington, who does not remember the frequent declarations at the commencement of the war that we should be completely satisfied if at the expense of one half we could defend the remainder of our possessions. Now, you little man, were never intended to share in the wealth. You were only ever intended to fight and die to protect their stuff. You're allowed to pass through. You're just a tenant, baby. You're property. All right? Only they get to live forever. Only their property gets to stay forever. You remember that? You remember that. Good God, exclaimed Washington in reply to General Knox, who besides a Tory could have foreseen or a Briton have predicted such a course of things? I do assure you that even at this moment, when I reflect upon the present aspect of our affairs, it seems to me like the visions of a dream. In answer to another letter of Colonel Humphreys, Washington said, I see from the Boston papers that the insurgents of Massachusetts, far from being satisfied with the redress offered by their general court. Now, let me throw in, the only redress offered was pardon from treason, meaning you didn't get hung. Not back pay, not anything else. Not anything else. Not anybody burning from the monetary destabilization. Not stopping the foreclosures or the mortgages. Not any of that. But you could get a pardon from treason. That's what you could get. That's sweet, right? So, yeah, they weren't happy about it. But anyway, he continues, are still acting in open violation of law and government. What gracious God is man that there should be such inconsistency and perfidiousness in his conduct? It was but the other day that we were shedding our blood to obtain the constitutions under which we now live, and which is a large fallacy and factual error of Master Washington's, since the Declaration was what they fought over using you, and the Articles were declared to be not good enough by them, because they said so. They did not shed jack shit. You did. Okay? All they shed was a little bit of fake-ass money, be it gold, silver, or paper. That's it. Now, constitutions of our own choice of making, and now we're unsheathing the sword to overturn them. Now, what he was trying to say is constitutions of his own choice and his own making, not intended for you. And the real sad part about all this is the fact that none of these people, even when they owed Shays and all the others, would ever pay. They never paid. They paid Shays 43 years afterwards, but with no interest. But yet they would charge you interest instead of quoting each other and making up laws. They went along to justify what they did. I mean, I'm not even for certain if Shays had the right to vote. So you can't possibly blame him for constitutions of our own choice. After all, he wasn't allowed one now, was he? No, he wasn't allowed a choice, and neither were you. So Congress raised troops, and the insurrection was suppressed in Massachusetts by military force, and New Hampshire by vigorous exertions of Governor Sullivan. Now, I'm going to throw a note in here. Notice how no details are added in the use of the founders' quotes. They're always real vague, where they skip the public executions, the debtors' prisons that were supposed to be stopped, yet they never were, indentured servitude extended until you died, loss of land, loss of all that. That's right. Marshall says, the most important effect of this unprovoked rebellion was the deep conviction it produced of the necessity of enlarging the powers of the general government, and the consequent direction of the public mind toward the convention which was to assemble at Philadelphia. Now again, notice he never says in there that we owed, therefore we paid, and the revolters stopped revolting and they went home satisfied. Never, ever do they do that, or ever do they say that. Nor do they ever actually pay their debts. They are special that way. That these events operated most powerfully on the mind of General Washington is most obvious from the passionate interest he evinced in the extracts we have given from his correspondence. They induced him to distrust the people, and threw him more under the influence of Hamilton in his policy of consolidation by usurpations. Now, I'm going to throw in a note as if Washington ever needed help for his ego or ambition. Yeah, I don't think so. The fact that Jefferson was cajoled by Hamilton into a cooperation with him in a measure so unconstitutional and corrupt as the assumption of the debts of the states must cast a mantle of charity forever over the cooperation of Washington in his future measures. Now, if you're tired of the fallacious word unconstitutional, remember I am too. It only means not constitutional, which means it doesn't offer the contract and therefore can never be law unless you consent. That's your revolution right now in progress. Yeah. Instead of unconstitutional, say extra-constitutional in an offer to contract. Watch how quick this stops. Here then, at the very outset of the government, the money power was triumphant in the assumption of the debts of the states. Now, again, let me note, as if you ever had to twist an elitist arm like Washington or Jefferson or any of the others, just as long as they got their cut of the pyramid scam first and you got no cut at all except by the knife. Now, you know that. This act spread wide discontent over the southern states. Southern corporations who could vote, but not you, not as usual. You had better make I'm telling you, you people better make the distinguishment now before they assume to make it for you. North Carolina passed law prohibiting the use of her jails and courthouses by the United States. And when it was proposed in her legislature that legislators should take the oath prescribed in the Constitution of the United States, they refused to do so. Now, this should clearly denote to you what and who Alex Jones, 90% of his guests, and that Stuart Rhodes work for. Rhodes is a damn bar associate, promoting openly that even your local officers should be and are federal employees. So much for local Republican government when a patriot like Rhodes and Mack are out there, Sheriff Mack. See again the ABA Journal of 1920 for further elucidation on how those people figured out how to get around all this by using local propaganda in your communities. That's what they are. They're communists, kids. That's all they are. The next measure influencing the course of parties in the United States was the incorporation of a United States bank by the government of the United States. Now, I'm going to tell this to all the idiot Ron Paul tards and all the gold and silver retards, all right? I want you to listen. I already know what's coming with H.R. 2990, and I'm going to knock your ass out of the ballpark, factually. And I do it over and over with fact and logic. Okay? There was no express power given to Congress in the Constitution to establish a bank, but the power was claimed by the consolidationists under the clause giving to Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying the expressly granted powers into execution. Where does it say, Grand Constitutionalist? Where they have the power to establish a bank. And it does not say. It does not say. Okay? All right. It's good. The farce of private banks and a federal-run bank has been going back and forth since day one. And that should tell you what it says, what's going on. Neither side is constitutional. Neither the Fed Reserve, who is extra-constitutional, meaning it is a choice, or a federal-run bank. Both are extra-constitutional outside of the Constitution, and therefore is a contract of instance by the user who bonds himself to them, you. A bank, it was contended, was necessary and proper to carry on the powers expressly granted to tax and to collect and disperse the taxes. At this time, the independent treasury policy by the government, for which we are indebted to Mr. Van Buren, of carrying on its fiscal operations by its own treasury officials, had not been tried. Note, again, it's extra-constitutional. The successful operation of this policy for 20 years before the late war has proved conclusively that a bank was not necessary and proper to the government of the United States or its treasury, because it has a fucking treasury that can do it all. People. Damn. Before the experiment, sophistries sufficiently plausible to blind even the Supreme Court of the United States were put forth in its defense, which, by the way, I might like Judge Napolitano, but the Supreme Court is useless as tits on a boar hog and is only designed to pass off bullshit as actual law. That is all it's designed to do. Okay? And to extend the power of the federal government. That's all they ever do, using constant voter trapping. Washington required the opinions in writing of his two great coadjutors in the government, Hamilton and Jefferson. They differed, and their difference marked the rise of the two great parties of the country, then called Federal and Republican parties. A limited or consolidated government, a free government, or a despotism stood out in the light of these opinions. Yet it is believed that although General Washington sided with the consolidationists, he did so not from the reasons assigned in Hamilton's opinion. He signed the bill with great reluctance, and sent it to the Senate only at the last moment, unaccompanied with any reasons for signing it. Mr. Van Buren, not without good reason, and apparently Mr. Madison, also were of opinion that he signed this bill for the same reason that both he and Jefferson had supported the assumption of the debts of the states. State necessity. Of course, such a reason he could not assign, and therefore none was expressed, but his approval without reason accomplished all that Hamilton wanted. It put Washington on the side of the consolidationists and threw the halo of his great name over their policy. No, what it did was the usual wrestling federation game. Behind closed doors, they knew it were going to go through because they had to control everything. That's what this did. The money power again triumphed in the incorporation of the Bank of the United States. The next step was to establish a funding system in imitation of Great Britain, where a man of sense has money to take up his debts. He does not fund it, that is, put it away or get somebody to keep it, but he pays his debts. If by funding is meant the putting aside together the evidences of debt after being paid, no system is required for such an operation. Seriously, he summed up actual, true economic policy right there. Upon sifting the policy in Great Britain, it was found to be worse than useless and was abolished. And it was abolished in this country and by a bill just passed in Washington, we suppose will be renewed by the money power at Washington. Mr. Jefferson's description of it, we presume, is as truthful now as it was in his day. He said it was a puzzle to exclude popular understanding and inquiry, and a machine for the corruption of the legislature. Yet they're okay with passing it. Do you not see how this is now? It is the nature of usurpation to be progressive. One usurpation from the discontent it occasions inspires another to suppress discontent. And so it was with the consolidationists. Popular indignation broke out in the public press, and the immigrants from foreign nations, being poor, had no affinity with the money power. Aliens were put under the control of the government, by being made amenable to arbitrary removal, and the free discussion and condemnation in the press of the measures of the government and those who administered it was called sedition. The passage of the Alien and Sedition laws inflamed the people everywhere, especially in the South. It produced a thorough sifting of the Constitution. The assumption of the debts of the states shook apart the elements of parties. The Bank of the United States formed them. But the Alien and Sedition laws laid down the foundations, broad and deep, which separate and must forever separate the two great parties of the country so long as the government of the United States shall continue a free government. Note, again, read treaties on American citizenship or corpus juris on the terms alien or absent for further detail, okay, on why they built that Alien and Sedition, okay? Intended to consolidate the government, these measures saved it from consolidation, and by the election of Mr. Jefferson to the presidency cast down the money power and made triumphant the plain principles of the Constitution and the liberty and justice it was intended to secure. Note, their discussion was over citizen versus alien in order to do like Wilson and the others after 1900 and World War I, to split the system in order to secure themselves but keep you out, thereby making certain that any power you had was only perceived perceived power in order to keep their system alive. And from day one, Washington and the others knew exactly what they were doing on those very vague parts of the Constitution. After all, you don't run the show because of those very vague parts. But at least there is a show. Unfortunately for the country, the wars in Europe soon diverted the attention of the people from the operation and principles of the government to the fierce struggles then pervading that continent. For a time, the parties divided in the United States upon the mere matter of sympathy with one or the other of the belligerents. At length, however, we were dragged into the vortex of war. The seizure of our ships for violating paper blockades and the searching them on the high seas and taking from their decks seamen in the United States would not be endured by the South. The War of 1812 declared against Great Britain was called, therefore, a Southern War. It was supported strenuously by the whole Democratic Party. But the money power in the North was exceedingly dissatisfied, although the war was instituted to enforce protection their ships and their seamen. But with these wrongs, they were nevertheless making money by being carriers for European belligerents. The war stopped their gains, and indifferent to wrongs when impeding gain, they turned furiously against the war and were just as ready to sacrifice their seamen citizens in the jails or dungeons of Great Britain as they were their soldiers taken in battle in the late war. Now, let me throw in, a lot of that's horse shit too, because you got to watch. Britain backed in the north Pontiac, the Indian chief there. Well, wouldn't you know, Britain backed out after the second failed Canadian invasion of us. But what did we lose? Well, we didn't. The treaty again took care of that. Everything went back to normal. The same exact thing, except we had gained a bunch of land. That's right, a bunch of land. And Pontiac and them ceased to exist. Ha! But they were not quite so consistent in another respect. They suddenly became Democrats. They assumed to be the staunch upholders of the rights of the states, and in the Hartford Convention affirmed substantially the constitutional doctrines of Mr. Madison's report on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The money power thus showed that it had no political principles whatsoever, but assumed or put off those which would, for the exigency of the time, subserve their purposes of money-making. Fortunately for them, but most unfortunately for the rest of the United States, peace arrested their meditated secession from the Union of the United States. At the close of the war in 1813, an era of good feeling and an oblivion of past differences ensued. Now, remember that the Treaty of Paris and what it plainly says, signed by 3 of the founders. Then also remember that the real gains for both of those was after they wiped out Pontiac. And also remember the gain that when we supposedly invaded Canada and got whooped twice, that Canada now became a nation with a national government being built up out of that. Oh, we got to get ready in case the U.S. invades again. Right? It's all a setup. It's all a setup. Which is really weird because, Canadians were not the British military and suddenly decided that now they're a nation of Canadians. Not what they were before. And they don't realize what they lost, not even now. So, General Jackson inculcated in a letter, and so Mr. Madison counseled in his messages. It really seemed as if the consolidationists were about to become Democrats, or the Democrats consolidationists, and so it proved to be. But which was most likely to occur, all history proves. A free government which discards its watchful guard and jealousy of power is sure to fall. The money power never sleeps, and indifference is sufficient to ensure its ascendancy. The fruit of the era of good feeling was soon seen in the legislation of Congress. A bill was introduced, said to be inspired by Mr. Madison, to establish another bank of the United States. Now, Mr. Madison was a member of the Congress which passed the first United States Bank Bill, the immediate cause of the organization and array of the two great parties of the country against each other. Now, I want you to take close note that banks and Congress only exist when the real territory of it has expanded, with settlers moving further and further away and forgetting these people and all these huckster governments even existed. And in order to beat the inevitable game theory, that settlers would have done being in communities of their own outside of theirs, and not being citizens of anyone at all because they're in territories that don't belong to anyone. The system must, by degree, insert itself into their communities. And the one way to do that is a constant but timely reboot of the monetary system. Now, you know that. It always works. So settlers who did the real work and who had real government woke up one day to find the United States and the states had fully fashioned county seats on their doorsteps where there were none before. Now, that's proof and fact of the voter trap that's so heavily used by the United States. Is they show up and they say, here we are. And then their agents say, okay, let's all be a state. End of story. You don't get a voice in it, okay? Now, he spoke against it and voted against it as unconstitutional. The members of Congress in 1815 constituted a new race of statesmen. A new race of statesmen. The foreign troubles and war which had intervened since the first Bank Bill had passed had left them but little acquainted with the great constitutional arguments occasioned by Washington's administration and the usurpations of the Federalists, but Mr. Madison could not have forgotten them. Now, the further with voter trapping here legitimizes what doesn't exist. And it's not a real contest. It's a fight between two groups to draw you in, to constantly agitate you to make you think you're a part of them when you never were. Because neither side's argument benefits you. That's not the point. It's to benefit them. That's why they have the argument. Now, and you're not allowed to be a full member of either side. Remember that. In order for any of it to work, you got to be involved. And Freneau says that all politicians must have a heavy stake in the game. Or as Bernie Mandeville said in 1705, they must grumble or they will not do what we want. They must get irritated and constantly be agitated or they won't do what we want. Now, he was originally inclined to nationalism. There was no Jefferson near or party pressure to restrain his original bias. He fell, therefore, easily into the hands of consolidationists. Now, let me throw in, isn't it magical, right? Oh, they're taking us over. No, they just ran free reign, which is what they were going to do anyway. That was the whole point of all of this, okay? Was to be in your absolute, the most minor thing of your life to keep you under their thumb. That's the point. Otherwise, they don't exist, okay? The Democratic Party had an overwhelming majority in both branches of Congress, and the fact that Mr. Madison, their president, their leader, and the expounder of the Constitution in 1798, who had built up their creed, should now uphold the very outrage on the Constitution which he and Jefferson had joined in denouncing, and cut the party loose from all their great principles. Right? Not law, but principles. Always these great doctrines and principles. They followed Mr. Madison and his bank, ignorant or reckless, and perhaps not aware that they were on the broad road to consolidation under the bland guidance of the money power. Multitudes calling themselves Democrats abandoned the principles of the Democratic Party. Amongst them, the most conspicuous were Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. Mr. Clay had been formerly a Democrat of the straightest sect, and he had delivered a speech in the Senate full of sound Democratic doctrine against a United States bank as inexpedient and unconstitutional. Yet he voted for Mr. Madison's bank. Now, I'm going to throw in, watch what Mr. Ron Paul does, not what he says. Watch what he does. Watch what they all do, not what they say. I don't care what they say. Put them in power, watch what they do. It's always the same thing. When he voted in the House of Representatives for Mr. Adams and made him President of the United States. Now, did you not just read that? When he voted in the House of Representatives for Mr. Adams and made him President of the United States, do you want me to read that one again? Okay, I will. When he voted in the House of Representatives for Mr. Adams and made him President of the United States, We have no idea that he voted for motives of personal interest. Oh, of course, politicians never have that. No, no. The corruption imputed to him was the most atrocious calumny. The truth was, Mr. Adams was the only one of the candidates before the House with whom he had an affinity of policy or principles. Like Mr. Clay, Mr. Adams was nominally a Democrat and had been voted for as such in the presidential election, but in reality he was, like Mr. Clay, an out-and-out centralist. Nothing, it appears to us, can more conclusively show the utter demoralization of the whole Democratic Party than the fact that both of these men, through consolidationists, were candidates of the Democratic Party for the presidency. Reaching the presidency, they were not slow in developing what they were. They became the leaders of the Consolidation Party, and in the measures recommended, boldly announced their policy. After the incorporation of a United States Bank, the next field for strategy and conquest on the part of the money power was the tariff. The war tariff was to be revised. The duties it imposed were laid in the midst of war to carry on its operations. Now, what did Freneau say about war and the military? Yeah, they were, of course, excessive, and the interest of the country required that they should be immediately reduced. Now, it's not that it is unlawful or extra-constitutional. You'll notice that they don't talk about that. They talk about putting it out, putting it forward, and it's too high, you bitch, so they reduce it. They don't get rid of it. See, that's the point. That's the trap. It's a death by degrees. It's a time-honored strategy. You offer a thing that is not real and at an exorbitant price. People revolt, so you offer the same thing again at a lower price. Nobody gets that. They pleaded that as the manufacturers in the North had sprung into existence to relieve the necessities of the people and assist the government during the war, it was neither just nor patriotic suddenly to leave them to a competition with foreign manufacturers, by which they must be ruined. And let me throw in, Mr. Alan Watt does an excellent work on the foreign competition, between China and the United States and all this fake competition and what it's really used for. Your country could easily support itself without any trade whatsoever. So why do we always got to get in a war with Britain and then get in another war and then get in a war with Mexico? And you begin to understand, why are you having trade wars at all? You can support yourself if you got the government out of it. Now, I don't mean corporations would be your friend. You'd have to disband them. That, they don't hold any water anyway. The point is, they use that in order to start a fake fight, okay, to keep you involved and working for the corporations and for the government. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any power or money at all, would they? Okay. They therefore asked only time to put in force equal skill or to disengage their interests if unable to meet foreign competition. Now, does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's pacification by game theory. The plea was successful and the tariff of 1816 was passed, not increasing any taxes but reducing those that were laid gradually through a series of years. Yes, I told you, when it gets bad, they've got to ease off the reins so you won't run away. Okay? But it'll still keep you on the leash, though. You'll keep yourself on the leash. Now, can it get any plainer than that right there? I mean, something that was extra constitutional added on to corporations, of course by corporations, who then balked magically at having to actually pay anything. Remember, think of this as an income tax per Freneau. That's what tariffs and everything is. Then accept a lower tariff that is still a tax with a different name, which is then passed on to who? You. It was never meant to do anything but to get you to work for the corporations and the government. That was the whole point, to legitimize both as if they had the authority or power to do those things, which they do not by law. But they can offer, and that's always what they do. Mr. Van Buren, in his book, says that this tariff was the beginning of the protective tariff policy. This, we think, is an error. The tariff of 1816 was no more a protective tariff than the subsequent tariff of 1833. Both of these tariffs were anti-protective tariffs and designed to put an end to the production afforded to manufacturers from the exceptional condition of the country by a gradual reduction of the duties to the revenue standard. Now, you will note, like I note, that none of the above made any sense. It wasn't supposed to. Ask Freneau, keep the scam dirt simple, sell it complicated to gain control of all the other parties with a tap dance and a smile, right? But at the same time, spewing complete gobbledygook. And nobody seems to comprehend that every bit of what they say is extra-constitutional, as they can only tax states, okay, by appropriation. Now they had the magical ability to tax corporations inside a state. Now the state agrees because now they have the ability to tax the corporations. And finally, you. That's the whole point. You. They want to tax you directly because without you, they don't have anything. Now look and see how this is what I'm saying. For all you retarded constitutionalists. Now look and see how far removed you are from the Constitution and your very idea of what it is. Okay? You're hawking a very highly modified version and saying you're constitutional. You're not even close. Not even close. It is true. Both of these tariffs were defeated in their object and defeated in the same way. The faithlessness of the money power. Now remember, Freneau said, advance the cause. It need not win. Set the precedent. The protective policy really commenced when the fraud, designed by the manufacturers from the first, took place of repealing the reductions of the tariff of 1816 as they consecutively matured. For the first time in the history of the country, duties on imports were retained, not for the exigencies of revenue, oh, of course not, but avowedly for the benefit of manufacturers from the enhanced prices they occasioned in the markets of the United States. Now, that's why they tell you, buy American, but you can only afford the Chinese. It sounds great. All you're doing is making for certain that no matter who you buy, you're still a slave to them. Now, if there is any one policy more than any other, essentially that of the consolidationists, it is that of a protective tariff. It was to engraft this policy upon the government of the United States that their great leader, Alexander Hamilton, exhausted his vast abilities in 1791 in his report on manufactures. Here are his modes of affording protection to manufacturers. Okay? So do not sit and say the bullshit that corporations never ran your country. They not only started it, they always ran it. The only thing you ever see is a sometimes real fight between them. That's it. That's all you get to see. The rest of the time, it's a dog and pony carny barking show to keep you involved. Otherwise, what did I say? They don't exist. 1, prohibitory duties. 2, by prohibitions of rival articles or duties equivalent to prohibition. But wait, we always had a free market. And this was in 1791. That's interesting. I wonder if Jones and them and all these other free market people of capitalism happen to have read this report. I bet you they haven't. 3, by prohibition of the exportation of the materials of manufacturers. 4, pecuniary bounties. 5, by premiums. 6, by exemption of the materials of manufacturers from duties. 7, by drawbacks of duties on the same materials. 8, by encouragement of new inventions at home and introduction of others from abroad. You see the trap? They're making everybody so screwed up interdependent on everybody else, they always win. You don't, they do. Now, 9, by judicious regulations for the inspection of manufactured commodities. Are they allowed to do that? Are they allowed to do that? Where in the Constitution does it say they can do that? Exactly. But yet they sit at the ports and do it all the time. Interesting. 10, by facilitating pecuniary remittances. Now, the whole scam here is to keep the money moving back and forth between everybody, right? You got to pay a fine, then you get a grant, and then you give that grant to somebody else that pays a fine. Yeah, that's right. Freneau laid all that out. It's got to be super complicated and not do anything except get you to pass it back and forth and believe in it. Yeah, that's that easy. 11, by facilitating the transportation of commodities by roads and canals. Now, I got to ask you, who claims that they own the roads and canals that they didn't build? I've never seen the government swing a hammer. I've seen men swing hammers, so I know who owns the roads and canals, and it is not the state, and it is not the county, it is not the city, it is the men that did that. Okay? All right. This policy of the report had everything to recommend it to the Consolidation Party. First, it gathered to its support the money power. Second, it was glaringly unconstitutional, excepting under the general phrases of the Constitution. General, what is it? What? There is no general phrases. It says it. And if you interpret it to mean anything else, well, that's extra constitutional. All right. Now, those were, like they are now, extra constitutional under any phrasing, because remember, kids, if it is not expressed, it therefore must be implied and inferred. Ask yourself why the founders left so much to be implied and inferred when they knew, because they were lawyers, they were bar associates, quite well how they were going to go, how things were going to go. If they were that smart, how did they not see what is coming? And you'll realize they did see it. That was the point. Duties for protection were claimed as an incident to the power to lay duties for revenue. Its object is the exclusion of the foreign commodity on which the taxes for revenue are raised, and thus really to destroy revenue. What's it? See, that makes no sense, does it? It doesn't. That's the point. Protection afforded must be exactly in proportion to the prohibition obtained. Third, it put the property and industry of the whole country, directly or indirectly, under the influence and control of the government of the United States, making it the grand almoner or scourge of the country, as its operations extended to its different interests. This report, so far as protection to manufacturers was concerned, was without enforcement. All right? Because if it's not law, it cannot be enforced. But you can agree to it, and they can enforce your agreement. All right. It was followed by a duty on imports of only 12%. The money power was then chiefly engaged in foreign and domestic commerce, but its general principles founded the Consolidation Party, and they lay deep, awaiting their development in measures as they should arise in the progress and industry of the country. The War of 1812, as we have seen by the Tariff of 1816, gave the opportunity for beginning and enforcing the protective policy. Mr. Clay at once embraced the whole policy of the report of Alexander Hamilton, and with protective tariffs joined appropriations of money for internal improvements by the general government. Now, magically, they have the power to do a bunch of stuff that they didn't before. Where does it say they can do internal improvements? Oh, I don't know where, man. That's right, it don't say it. That's not the point, is it? Taxes were to be collected, on the one hand, in the progress of prohibition, to benefit the manufacturers, and on the other, were to be expended in the boundless field of internal improvements. They have to give themselves a job. Okay? Mr. Clay called this the American system. It was nothing but robbery by which property was taken from some of the people and given to others. But it was very imposing in a new country needing capital. Note, welcome to capitalism, by the way. It is the same as communism and socialism and fascism. Always. Its supporters soon dropped the name of Democrats and assumed the name of Whigs. A new name was necessary to bridge the way over to the consolidationists. You don't need to constantly change your name. Why would you do that? Exactly. Of course, the war tariff kept up by arresting the reductions prescribed in the tariff of 1816 could not satiate the greed of the manufacturers. New interests sprang up which wanted new encouragements. Pennsylvania had coal and iron beds, which could be made productive of money. If everybody in the United States were made to pay tribute to her coal and iron capitalists, she struck for her interests and led the demand for an increase of duties on imports by the tariff of 1824. A new vocabulary by this time became necessary to suit the striped motley of democracy. There were tariff Democrats, internal improvements Democrats, bank Democrats, and the blackest of all stripes, consolidation Democrats. Now, does that sound familiar with Molly Nux? Oh, and all of them. Adam Kokesh? That's right, it sounds real familiar, don't it? Minarchists, anarcho-capitalists. Same old game, never gets old. With the exception that you know what the game is. They don't. Instead of being ejected from the party, these consolidationists on all these important measures of policy, directly springing from the great principles on which parties were organized, were allowed to remain in the bosom of the Democratic Party, sharing its honors but betraying it at every turn of the wheel of events, bringing their infidelity into operation. The party thus became but little more than a mere association to obtain office and power. I do like how it just magically became that. Was never used for that before. Oh no. A test of its real nature was soon put to it by the manufacturers. Insatiable as ever, they came forward again to Congress in 1828 for another increase of the tariff to subserve their interests. At this time, the national debt was nearly paid. And what would have happened if the debt had been paid? You wouldn't have to go to work no more. You would see a lot of things stop. So they got to have a national debt. From day one, we had it. Washington made certain of that. So did Congress. Instead of increasing the tariff, the interest of the government required that it should be reduced to avoid the collection of taxes not needed by the government. The manufacturers and the consolidationists were perfectly indifferent to the wants of the government. They wanted more taxes on the people, that they should make more money, and accordingly the Tariff Bill of 1828 was passed by Congress, called, from its unjust excesses, the Bill of Abominations. For this bill, Mr. Van Buren, then a senator, voted. The whole southern country was deeply moved by the passage of the tariff of 1828, and South Carolina called a convention of her people, and in 1832 nullified it, with the distinct declaration that if coercion was attempted by the general government, she would secede from the Union. In nullifying this act, she put her right to do so upon the principles of the Democratic Party, as laid down in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and 1799. General Jackson, who was then president by the vote of the Democratic Party, had caused General Hayne's speech in the Senate in reply to Mr. Webster, in which his resolutions were relied on as truthful exponents of the Constitution, to be printed on satin and hung up in his parlor. All his life long, he had been a Democrat. His Secretary of State, Mr. Livingston, had maintained with great ability in the Senate the doctrine of these resolutions, but when practically enforced by the nullification of South Carolina, President Jackson put forth a proclamation written by Mr. Livingston in which they were denounced as treasonable. This proclamation denied the sovereignty of the states. It denied the right of secession. It denied, by a flat construction, which made it mean nothing, the doctrine of the Declaration of Independence, that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government over them and institute new governments, which to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It affirms that the allegiance of the citizen of the United States is due to the government of the United States, thus investing this government with supreme sovereignty of the country. Now, at any point, does any of that say they have the power to override a state? Does it say the law says any of the above is true and that the United States is separate from the states with citizens of its own? It does not, but it does say that legally a citizen of the United States will uphold the United States as supreme over itself. That would be because it is extra-constitutional. A corporation created with citizens that choose and consent to be a citizen of the District of Columbia United States Corporation. It says nothing of the state. Okay? All this is capital consolidation doctrine, only much stronger than even consolidationists had heretofore ventured to affirm, and it gave them an ample cloak wherewith to cover over their whole policy in the late war. We are aware that after the tariff contest was over, General Jackson endeavored through the Washington Globe to explain away the gross consolidation doctrines his proclamation contained, and to make them consistent with the antagonistic principles of the Democratic Party. But what he meant at the time is too clearly evinced by his acts to be misunderstood. The force bill was the logical sequence of his proclamation, containing a direct appeal to arms. Mr. Madison demoralized the Democratic Party by his measure, the bank. President Jackson completed its demoralization by upsetting its principles. It is not at all surprising that when he visited New England and passed under a triumphal arch, he saw inscribed upon its entablature the principles of the proclamation, the principles of New England. The truth is, the whole Democratic Party, excepting the states' right men of the South, had laid their principles at the feet of General Jackson. Mr. Van Buren, then Vice President of the United States, supported his whole policy. Why his book contains no reference to the sovereignty of the states is now, we presume, apparent. The Compromise Tariff of 1833 settled the agitations on this subject. It was followed by other subjects of contest. The renewal of the Charter of the Bank of the United States on the appropriations of money by Congress for internal improvements. On both of these subjects, General Jackson fell back on the principles and policy of the Democratic Party. He vetoed them, and although a majority, consisting largely of bank Democrats, passed the bills, they could not get the two-thirds necessary to overrule his vetoes. The vetoes prevailed, and these measures failed. Mr. Van Buren became the President of the United States in 1837. Shortly after his term of service commenced, the commercial convulsions, occasioning the suspension by the banks of payments in specie, compelled him to call Congress together to obtain the means to carry on the government and to reorganize the Treasury Department. Under his recommendation, the independent Treasury policy was established, supported by the States' Right Party of the South. It was a measure eminently conservative and democratic. However, let me throw in, that has nothing to do with the Constitution. That's all extra-constitutional. They could have fixed it. They didn't need a new policy of an independent treasury, did they? No, they didn't. But it sounds nice, doesn't it? That's right. It's a scam. In order, however, to justify future party affinity between those who had lately supported General Jackson's proclamation and those from the South who had voted for the independent treasury, a reaffirmation of the fundamental principles of the Democratic Party is laid down in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and 1799 was deemed necessary. Accordingly, a caucus of the Democratic members of Congress was held, and an address was put forth to the people of the United States, affirming and defending them. Thus, again, the Democratic Party, in seeming at least, was reunited on its ancient principles and policy. The consolidationists colonists, ever ready to devise new expedients to renew their power, immediately after the settlement of the contest in 1833, turned to the institution of slavery in the South to create agitation and inflame the popular mind of the North in their favor. Its existence in the District of Columbia gave them a lever for agitation. Accordingly, in 1835, a concerted movement was made in Congress to effect the disintegration of parties by petitions to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. The agitation was quite successful. Year after year, the two great sections of the Union separated wider and wider apart as the agitation spread itself to slavery in the other states, as it was originally designed to do. The Democratic Party for many years stood firm in its fidelity to the Constitution. Now let me throw in, as if that ever happened, everybody was pulling stunts as fast as possible as soon as they shoved that through to see what they could get away with, and it worked. At length, in the presidential election of 1848, it divided, and Martin Van Buren was the leader of the schism. Without impugning the motives of Mr. Van Buren, it is due to truth and history that the circumstances under which he acted should be clearly exposed. He defeated and cast down the Democratic Party from power at a most critical period in the affairs of the United States. Mr. Van Buren was elected President of the United States in 1836 as the candidate of the Democratic Party under the nomination of a national convention. Now, just remember, you didn't pick him, much like Ron Paul or any of the others. Score 1, canvassing boards, score 0, you. In 1839, he was nominated again by the Democratic Party as their candidate for the presidency. He thus had all the power of this party twice put forth for his elevation to the presidency. In May 1848, the Democratic Party, in just such a convention as had twice nominated him, nominated General Cass as their candidate at the approaching presidential election. The Mexican War had been previously going on, and Mr. Wilmot, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, had offered to an appropriation bill to carry on the war, a proviso excluding slavery from all territory which might be acquired by the war. Mr. Cass, some 6 months before the Democratic Convention assembled in 1848, had written a letter to Mr. Nicholson of Tennessee in which he said, referring to the Wilmot proviso, the principle it involves should be kept out of the national legislature and left to the people of the Confederacy in their respective local governments. Now, welcome to the Republic. Well, there is no democracy in the Constitution. The old counties, where no constitutional oath was made, no city or county corporations held sway, where no federal government existed, nor do their officers sit and run your towns. But I like how all this is brand new. Here, General Cass says nothing about the constitutional power of Congress to exclude slavery from the territories of the United States. He simply, as a matter of policy, affirms that the principles involved should be kept out of the national legislature. Nor does he assert that it should be left to the people of the territories, but that it should be left to the people of the Confederacy in their respective local governments. Who are the people of a confederacy? Certainly people of the states, and a part of the Confederacy should control the matter. Now, he's making a distinction here, though you are not. He's saying the people that run the states, who are not you, since you didn't have the right to vote, should run this issue in their respective local governments. Okay? Things had started to change, but that's the way it is. Mr. Van Buren, in June 1848, 7 months after the date of Mr. Cass's letter, and a month after he was nominated for the presidency by the Democratic Convention, addresses a letter to N.J. Waterbury and other free soil Democrats in reply to General Cass's letter, in which he labors to prove what General Cass had not denied, that Congress has the power to prohibit slavery from the territories of the United States. All right? Of the United States. And 2 months after, he was nominated by the Free Soil Party as their candidate for the presidency in a convention held at Buffalo, and accepted their nomination. One of the resolutions adopted at this convention is as follows: that the Democrat and Whig conventions have dissolved the National Party organizations heretofore existing by nominating for the Chief Magistracy of the United States, under slaveholding dictation, candidates neither of whom can be supported by the opponents of slavery, etc. These candidates were General Taylor and General Cass, and in its platform of principles, the convention of the Democratic Party said not one word in favor of the rights of the South in our territories. On the contrary, when Mr. Yancey introduced the following resolution, it was rejected by a vote of 216 to 36, the 36 votes all being from southern states. Resolved, that the doctrine of non-interference with the rights of property of any portion of the people of this Confederacy, be it in the states or territories thereof, or by any other than the parties interested therein, is the true Republican doctrine recognized by this body. Now, remember, only about 3% of the entire Southern population even owned slaves. That's correct. All rich corporation families, and certainly not me. Okay. It was from this sort of slaveholding dictation that Martin Van Buren felt himself bound to abandon the Democratic Party, deeming it dissolved. That he believed the Whig Party dissolved is scarcely within the scope of possibility, since he proposed, by his secession from the Democratic Party, to make it triumphant, as he did, at the approaching presidential election. Nor could he have deemed the Democratic Party dissolved at that time, although doubtless it was his intention to make it so, and he did make it so. The failure of the Democratic Party at that election and the election of General Taylor was a disaster which led directly to all future complicities and contests, which resulted in the dissolution of the party and the downfall of the Constitution and the Union. The principle on which he abandoned the Democratic Party, the ejection of the slaveholding states from our territories, right? The ejection of the slaveholding states from our territories was fatal to all parties but one, the old Consolidation Party, against which his whole book levels its fierce condemnations, and which it closes in describing in the following words: the course of events to which I have referred has had the effect of breaking up, as a national organization, the party opposed to the Democratic Party, leaving the latter the only political association coextensive in its power and influence with the Union, and the sole survivor of all its national competitors. Eheu jam sati, instantly sufficient. The last act of the grand drama of the dissolution of the Democratic Party was performed by Stephen A. Douglas. The play commenced by the defeat of the Democratic Party and the elevation of General Taylor to the presidency through the agency of Mr. Van Buren. Okay, now, what did that say right there? Let me try this one again. The play commenced by the defeat of the Democratic Party and the elevation of General Taylor to the presidency through the agency of Mr. Van Buren. California, New Mexico, and Utah territories had just been acquired from Mexico by the previous administration. California, from its position on the Pacific and from its size, equal to 7 large states, was a real matter of contest. If excluded from that, admission into the interior sterile territories of Utah and New Mexico was hardly worth one word of contest on the part of the South. General Taylor, as one of his eulogists said of him, with the true instincts of a soldier, put the sword into the contest. He ordered one of his generals, General Riley, then at the head of the United States troops in California, to issue a proclamation calling the people of California into a convention. Yeah, that's right. Military force. Prescribing the qualifications of voters, the election districts, the times and places of holding the elections, and those who should hold them. Who should hold them? And the time and place for the meeting of the convention. All this was done to oust one half of the Confederacy from their constitutional rights in California. There was a judicial tribunal organized by the Constitution to try these rights, which shortly thereafter determined that, as claimed by the South, they did exist. But whether they existed or not, the introduction of the military power of the government to extinguish them throughout a vast country was fatal to free government. But they're only doing it now with TSA, with hands down my pantses. I don't understand. Now, remember Freneau, Republic to Monarchy? Rule 10, divide and govern, is a maxim consecrated by the experience of ages, and should be familiar in its use to every politician as a knife he carries in his pocket. In the work here to be executed, the best effects may be produced by this maxim, and with peculiar facility. An extensive republic made up of lesser republics necessarily contains various sorts of people, distinguished by local and other interests and prejudices. Let the whole group be well examined in all its parts and relations, geographical and political, metaphysical and metaphorical. Let there be first a northern and a southern section, by a line running east and west, and then an eastern and western section, by a line running north and south. By a suitable nomenclature, the landholders cultivating different articles can be discriminated from one another, all from the class of merchants, and both from that of manufacturers. But hey, nobody's ever seen this coming, and yet he wrote that in 1792. Interesting. For far less usurpations of military power, what threats were expressed towards General Jackson? General Taylor ought to have been impeached, but floating on the angry tide of revolution, he felt he could do anything. The North had already repudiated the Constitution, and General Taylor was only carrying out the higher law of his Northern political associates. Besides, he was sure of the support of the Southern Whigs, who had been most zealous for his election. Accordingly, when Congress assembled, the South stood divided. Ooh, the South stood divided. The Southern Whigs all supported the gross military usurpation and fraud perpetrated by General Taylor for the exclusion of slavery from California. If they had united with the Southern states' rights men and Democrats, the issue between the North and the South would have been made up. Now, let me throw in, obviously, that wasn't the plan, was it? The plan was to push the ball forward to see how far they could go, not how far they could not go. South Carolina, for a second time, had called a convention, and with their support would certainly have seceded from the Union if California had been admitted into it with her military constitution. But the Southern Whigs followed General Taylor and Mr. Clay. Another delay with another compromise unwisely put off the contest, which past events clearly indicated, and have since proved to have been inevitable, whilst the South was growing weaker and the North stronger every day. Note, which it most assuredly was not, this is a voter trap using both sides. It was to implement the federal government into even the local level, which is what Reconstruction did. Because they used Union troops to pacify towns that were not even fighting back. That's correct. After the Civil War, they took over the Southern political structures. Hence, carpetbaggers, land, all these, yes, there you go. The same cause which defeated the readjustment of the Confederacy in 1833 defeated it in 1850, a divided South. If, on either of these occasions, the South, or only the Gulf States, had stood together, a bloodless reformation would have saved the Constitution and have perpetuated the Union it established. It is time which dissipates false confidences and proves us to be wise men or fools. The Southern Whigs commenced their terms of compromise by yielding at once the chief matter in dispute, They exhausted their eloquence and threats on the outrage of excluding the South from New Mexico and Utah also. Now, sounds weird the way he's saying it, isn't it? Yeah, and you're going, I don't understand. How could they exclude? Well, just watch. Here they took their stand, and here the representatives of the South fought their humble battle for the interests and honors of the South. They succeeded in obtaining nothing whatever, nothing but what was theirs by the Constitution, prescribing in the bill making Utah a territory, afterwards extended to New Mexico. The following words, and when the said territory or any portion of the same shall be admitted as a state, it shall be received into the Union with or without slavery, as their Constitution may prescribe at the time of their admission. Now, let me throw in that says way more than one thing. But anyway, we'll stick with the basics. This is what the South got to be applied to all our territories for surrendering California. And it was called, for what reason it is not easy to understand, a compromise. The other items of the compromise were of the same character, giving the South what the Constitution gave. It would seem plain that the insolence and faithlessness which extorted such a compromise could not be relied on to preserve it. This was soon made apparent. At the next Congress, which assembled after this compromise was adopted in 1853, Mr. Douglas, as chairman of the Committee on Territories, reported a bill carrying out the terms of the compromise, organizing territorial governments for Kansas and Nebraska. Now, do you see what they're doing? All right. You do. Okay. What they are saying is that a contract was set in force between the Union and Confederacy, that certain territories, depending on who owned them, could allow or exclude slavery per the terms of the contract. All right, now the Constitution wasn't good enough, so they had to do compromises like the Missouri Compromise and etc. Okay? Remember that the lands we were talking about already had community governments, and now the shysters from both sides were showing up to divvy those up by saying territories were either territories of the states or territories of the United States, okay? And therefore must have constitutions. And the South did not dispute that. They only stipulated that some state franchises got to pick, others did not, but they never disputed that all territory franchises of the United States were under the District of Columbia. Meaning anyone that was a territory of the United States is automatically under the District of Columbia. They never disputed that. If he intended to carry out the terms of the compromise contained in the Utah bill, as he professed to do, nothing was more natural and easy than to insert the words of the Utah Act in the Kansas-Nebraska bill. But this he does not do. The Kansas bill, at his instance, was amended by the words following: it being the true interest and meaning of this act, not to legislate slavery into any territory or state. Now watch. Into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. See, now you see what they're trying to do. That's right. That overrides the state. If you accept that, and the state is formed under that, that means the state is under the United States Corporation instead of being a state outside making up the Confederacy of the United States. There you go. Here lurks Mr. Douglas' future doctrine of territorial sovereignty, or, as it was called, squatter sovereignty. The compromise, as contained in the Utah Act, provides that the option with or without slavery shall be made by the people of a territory, as their constitution may prescribe at the time of their admission into the Union. It has to be done in their constitution, and it has to be done at the time of their admission into the Union. Mr. Douglas' Kansas bill does not touch either of these important requirements and conditions. It merely leaves the people thereof in a territory perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way. The Southern representatives seem not to have apprehended the marked difference between the words of the compromise and Mr. Douglas' clause in the Kansas bill. But Mr. Chase discerned it, and he proposed to Mr. Douglas's clause, above quoted and adopted, the following: under which the people of the territory, through their appropriate representatives, may, if they see fit, prohibit the existence of slavery. This amendment was rejected in the Senate by a vote of 36 to 10, Mr. Douglas voting with the majority. Here is the original of Mr. Douglas' squatter sovereignty. Mr. Chase, conscious that a territorial legislature could have no power to exclude slavery from a territory, prepared to give the power. But Mr. Douglas, after refusing to grant it by Congress, claimed it as belonging to the people of a territory from their inherent sovereignty. Yeah, besides the obvious stated here, the squatter sovereignty belongs to the people, all right, which are citizens of the United States who supposedly somehow settled territory of the United States, right, and therefore could not have sovereignty. Yes, there's a whole bunch of fun stuff going in here. This is a transitory or constructed fight of presumption and what citizens were and what they were allowed to do. Now, notice it never says inhabitants of a territory, because those are non-citizens. For once in the Union, not the Confederacy, they were trying to give citizens of the national corporation a sovereign status to do as they pleased and basically to override all others. This can easily be proven out by one fact prior to all statehoods. You didn't have a magical constitution in the state, but the second one of the people showed up claiming everything is a territory of the United States. You got a state franchise constitution. For example, Georgia is on her 10th. California is on her 5th, I think. I think Oklahoma's on her 3rd, or I don't know. Well, yeah, we're just a little over 100 years old. How a territory from its nature is a dependency could be asserted to be sovereign is one of those queer intellectual exhibitions which no other country than the northern United States could have produced. The people of a territory can have not one single element of supremacy. Now, I'm going to tell you, remember, he's talking about citizens of a territory of the United States Corporation, or consenting to such a definition and contract offer. Because if you're not part of the United States and you're on land that nobody owns, you are sovereign. But now what you're saying is they're trying to contract and drag everybody that was already there into itself, into the corporation. Okay? Now, a United States territory is a dependency of the United States. I proved that with Fraser's River and Jacob Astor. They are dependents and inhabit a dependency. No, now you know, let me throw this in. Now you know what employment of an infant means. By law of agency, you are a dependent of the United States Corporation. Majority is reached when you become bonded to the corporation via oath and paperwork and holding an office, thereby being an agent of, and by being traded as a full share citizen, and not just inferior forms of citizens such as presumptive 14th Amendment and or in the military. Okay? Whose government can be altered or abolished at the will of a superior authority. Now, you'll notice the phrase superior authority. Now, that's just easy, because if you are a citizen, even full share, does not make you one of the people. People. Remember the Northwestern Company and Hudson Bay and the others? That's right. I want you to remember that, because one of the people truly are one of the few and the proud. And politicians, even being full share, did not create the government. They are simply agents of it. The original families are the people. The creators of a thing are the owners, Dominium Utile, and the British Crown through their agents, Northwestern Company. Those are Dominium Directum per law of real property in Black's Fifth. You are not one of the people, and neither are the politicians. The families and corporations are, though. But, strange to say, while Mr. Douglas and his party affirmed that the people of a territory were sovereign, when the southern states, which according to the creed of the Democratic Party were sovereign, and asserted it in setting up a government for themselves, these people denied they possessed the attribute of sovereignty. Now, what he's saying is doing the little setup scam means you agree that you got rid of your stuff. Now, you're seeing a fight between the union of the original creditor states and the new Confederacy, who were considered debtor states. All right? Now, not the old Confederacy. New territories that were stuck in between either being part of the Union or part of the Confederacy. They were kind of a new Confederate state, like Oklahoma would be considered to be, right? Those are considered debtor states, if you're part of the Union at least. They were denied sovereignty because that, at best, they were citizens of the original states and the U.S. corporation, but were not people who are a separate class, the creators of the Union. The southern states were getting uppity, as you know, and wanted to be as sovereign as the Union people. And we know what happened. We already know what happened. Sovereignty was in a territory, but not in a state which owned the territory. And this was the Northern Democratic statesmanship. Now, let me throw in here, he is saying that sovereignty is in the United States corporation, specifically the people who claim the territory. But the state who was granted Dominium Utile does not have it, does not have sovereignty. They have the right to profit and use only. And use what? Use you. And you only have the right to use it, but way on down the bottom, way a different diminutive form. Because if you got to pay taxes instead of receiving them, by law that means you do not have the right to own and not even possess. However, that said, this can and does get screwy because not everyone knows exactly what they were trying to pull. But after the wrestling matches, right, out for the public at the Pizza Hut, when they talked about the real Utile and Directum, it may and could be said from the above that the United States Corporation owns Directum and the state franchise, the Union States, Union State franchises, get Utile. That might be exactly what it is. You must remember these things as absolute law. None of this applies in the real world. You cannot sell nor purchase what you do not own, no matter what fancy legal legislation is passed. And neither the U.S., the British, or any other so-called country and corporation ever had the ability to buy it from the Indians who said they do not own it. So they cannot sell it. Right? At best, the state franchise and the U.S. corporation might claim it by conquest, but that will only last until they are proven factually incorrect and kicked off as deceasers. They do not have the law on their side, kids. This is the entirety of the pyramid scheme from day one, all of it. The rest that you deal with are diminutives of the original Ponzi. Ron Polinol, this diminutives. Those are dwarves of the original Ponzi out front of the tent, okay, with the Carney Barker. Secondly, by law, this disproves any lawful validity of equity and or trust law because that is a diminutive of even the inferior diminutives and is legal, not lawful. At best, trust law is a fight over the table scraps of the corporation pyramid scam, okay? So you cannot claim sovereignty and then claim trust law. It will not work. Because you cannot be sovereign inside the United States corporation. That does not happen. Okay, now, however absurd this doctrine was, it afforded a shortcut to the appropriation of all the territories of the United States by the people of the North. By their greater population, they could easily crowd a territory with its first settlers. Now, let me throw in here, I know better than that. That is a lie. And there's a bunch of lies they talk about when they talk about Oklahoma and the three land rushes. People were already here. Now, I'm going to tell you how they're going to say settlers. The first company recognized settlers by legal law, right? They'll recognize only their corporation settlers, but not you. And by controlling its legislature, exclude slavery. Okay. Now, our problem was there was a big stink that they ran for the first time in history. Oklahoma was the first one to run a Democratic convention, if you want to call it a statehood convention. Democratic. That's right. A vote of the majority, not a republic. That's correct. You didn't know that, did you? Yeah. And it caused a big stink because they were pulling settlers, talking in settlers to coming out of Kansas, Nebraska, and everywhere else to vote in our statehood election. Plus, our first governor, right before he became the first governor, took the original Oklahoma Constitution and disappeared for a few days and brought it back. That's correct as well. Now, neither the Wilmot Proviso nor the Missouri Compromise were half as efficacious, as its author argued, to appropriate our territories for northern settlement. Now, remember the tater famine and the immigrants leaving Ireland? The corporations knew all that. And Britain obviously knew. And they were making certain those people had somewhere to go. They're flushing them out of the cities so they could claim as much land as possible. Okay? And make money off of it. Mr. Douglas at first did not announce his discovery of squatter sovereignty. Discovery, right? He had prepared it only to serve him as a retreat. The northern people were aroused by passionate appeals against the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, although the North in Congress again and again repudiated it, and in the California Compromise had set up for our territories a principle totally inconsistent with its continuance. Now, remember the strategy, okay? If they could not win by forcing it on you at first, they would half-step and scam you through a compromise, a contract offer, but not between you and I. It is never between us. It is always a successful attempt to push the ball forward. It is a win, even if it is a draw. A scam many of the patriot parrot-paltards try to say on injecting issues, when they only ever inject extra constitutional ones. Okay? Because you'll hear Jonesy say, well, Ron Paul's injecting real issues. No, he's setting up a voter trap. That is what he's doing. Okay? All right, it pushes the ball forward. They still win because they've got it sitting on the table. And then they'll grab it, and you won't argue over it when they screw you with it. Yeah, see? That's how it always goes. Mr. Douglas' popularity was shaken in the North. The North had always been victorious over the South. Why should not the South acquiesce in being duped and checked, as it always had been in all previous compromises? Now, you might note that they're not duped, all right, that everybody else won at the top, no matter how many contests they had. The people won, some of the citizens won, but, as usual, you did not win. He launched forth in the Senate in favor of squatter sovereignty. In the meantime, the Dred Scott case came on for decision in the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court determined that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and that all the people of the United States had a right to colonize our territories, and to carry with them whatever was considered property in the several states from which they came. This decision was inconsistent with the power claimed for Congress to preclude by its legislation slavery from our territories on the one hand and squatter sovereignty on the other. Again, they're trying to make it sound like they have the right to come in and overrule you. Yes, that's what they're saying. Now, when you get a chance, check up on the Dred Scott case, because it does a lot more than just that. But I won't go into it here, though it does begin the legal definition in more detail of what a citizen is, of a citizen. The most important part of it is not the so-called slavery issue. It is that it is a simple voter trap being brought in, so that they magically had the authority through the Supreme Court of the Union to speak on a thing they had no right or authority to speak upon. To speak on it and then rule upon it, thereby legislating upon it, is extra constitutional and therefore can only stand as a contract offer to exclude slavery. All right? It ought to have occasioned the abandonment of both these constitutional heresies because they're both extra constitutional, okay? But so feeble had the Constitution become that this decision rather exasperated than allayed the excitement in the North. Now, let me throw this in when you hear stupid shit like the Constitution is shredded, right? No, it hasn't, you moron. Go shoot the politician going outside of it and then see if that piece of paper that is not law for you or I somehow magically becomes unshredded. It was never law for them. They make the legal law. After all, the good old Constitution made sure to say that. You only have weak men with weak wills and weak minds, not weak pieces of paper that don't count. All right? That's all there is to it. The Charleston Convention assembled for the nomination of Democratic candidates in the then approaching presidential election. Mr. Douglas was the most prominent candidate. He had only to be true to the Constitution as expounded by the Supreme Court of the United States, and his election was certain. Now, let me throw in, remember that the Supreme Court is well known for doing the magic, horrid things in the worst of times, which is interpreting the Constitution for what it never says and voter trapping people. I'm serious. That's all it is designed to do, the Supreme Court. That and constantly redefine things that are outside its jurisdiction anyway. Now, the Southern democracy in the convention required that either the doctrine of squattery, if you want, should be repudiated or that the Dred Scott case should be supported or affirmed. The Democratic Party in the convention, with its northern majority, refused to do either. The Southern delegates withdrew from the convention, and the Democratic Party was rent in twain. Note, I want you to note that here comes the fake voter trap issue. Both sides are completely extra constitutional, and a fight over something it never says. And now they got to bust it all up, right? See now, so you can see the scam. They got to bust it up. Oh, it's going horrid, right? Yeah, right. All they ever had to do is stand up and say it's not constitutional. Goodbye. That's not the law. That's it. But they never do that, do they? They have to have long, protracted, drag-out fights, months, years, go to the Supreme Court. Yeah, see, that's the whole point. Mr. Douglas, in the presidential election, which ensued, like Mr. Van Buren in 1848, overthrew the Democratic Party and defeated himself. But I bet you, while he may have defeated the Democratic Party, he did exactly what was required of him. The war which followed would not have taken place with his elevation to the presidency, but by putting Abraham Lincoln into the presidential office, war was inevitable. The consolidationists wanted war, for war would produce the grand end of all their party policy. It would spread lawless force all over the land and extinguish the Constitution, bring debt and debtors to the support of their party, and bring boundless imposts to enrich the money power and manufacturers. Now, that's, to me, if you ask me, that's only one. But this is the true era of extra constitutionality, especially with executive orders, all right? That includes the farce of the greenback and any other issuance from the executive, which holds no lawful water. Because if it did hold lawful water, it would mean that no Constitution applies. And if no Constitution applies to them above, it most certainly does not apply to everybody below. All right? I like the new parrot patriot thing, though. Yeah, I don't think so. If it don't apply to them, it most assuredly doesn't apply to me. Okay? With a fearsome politic energy, they readily drew the sword against the portion of the Democratic Party which had given it its principles, and led it on in enforcing them to 1,000 victories. The Democratic Party, North, followed in its track of blood and despotism. Where they now are, it is not easy to understand. If there be any man who believes that the people of the United States can be kept together under a government ruled as the government of the United States has been by the party in power, we have nothing to say to him. The new nation is nothing but the old result of old despotism by centralization, which has hitherto crushed all the free governments which have failed in the world. We presume that the people of the United States now apprehend their condition. Let me throw in our irony. How many times shall we do this over and over and realize that consolidation in the government of the United States is the despotism of a majority, irresponsible and ruthless, and that the rule of the money power is oppressive, tyranny, war. What liberty, equality, and humanity may mean in government is once more developed in the late war for the instruction of the world as it was previously in the French Revolution. Now, he's going to throw in a part here, whether you like it or not. He says it. The poor Negro, whose welfare afforded the pretext for revolution, is retrograding and dying away. And his race, if they can ever appreciate their condition, present or future in the world, will yet rise up and curse the philanthropy which has tortured them to destruction. War, debt, taxes, a regular humanitarian war, the most barbarous and cruel which, for 2 centuries, has been waged by one Christian people on another. Debt, the heaviest in proportion to their means which rests on any people in the world, made still heavier by the plunder of manufacturers and the extortion and fraud of bondholders, paper bankers, and paper money. Let me throw in, as usual, gold and silver. Failed all the time. Taxes, laid to suit the money power of the North, to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And withal the Constitution and Union our fathers gave us gone, and the government of the United States vast despotic money oligarchy. We take it for granted that reformation must come, and there is but one party which can bring this reformation, the Democratic Party, and but one policy which can accomplish it, the policy of the Democratic Party. Turn as we may, we must abolish centralism to be free, and we must restore the states to their rightful sovereignty, to have a union of states. Any expedient short of these 2 fundamental conditions must prove illusory and vain. The history of parties, which we have tried faithfully to portray, shows that there can be no stopping place to usurpations on the Constitution. It must be as sacred from profane hands as the Ark of the Covenant. Any departure from its principles must sap the zeal and strength of any party which rests on the Constitution for its existence. The vain attempt was made in the Democratic Party to keep up a party organization amongst those who had no common principles. Tariff Democrats, internal improvements Democrats, bank Democrats, and consolidation Democrats were allowed to join in party association and to enter party conventions with those who eschewed all these measures of policy as inconsistent with the Constitution and the Union it established. What was the necessary consequence? The party became the recourse of ambitious adventurers in politics to obtain personal distinction and power. And when their interest or their pique required it, they divided it and destroyed it. The war found the party feeble from the heterogeneous elements which composed it, but with no confidence in its members, and no brave reliance on the great principles which, for more than half a century, had given it renown and victory. Now let me throw in, they do all these great espousing, all these stupid great principles, right? They're so great, it constantly fails, and everybody gets screwed. Let's go back to the Constitution. Why? So we can get screwed again? I'm not stupid, right? This is getting real tiresome. You know, enough of my family have done this enough times that I'm just not interested in listening to a bunch of huckster, hacker, and bullshitters, okay? So, to hell with something they never stuck with anyway, and to hell with something that never applied to me to begin with, because I ain't the one that ever got to run it. No, and neither were you. So I really don't want to hear about how fucking great it was, okay? Like I said, be worried about your towns. That's what you need to worry about. To hell with everything else. Now, Ron Paul is talking about this right here, the Confederacy again. If you'll notice, that is exactly what's already in my Law of War video under the United Nations International Law. Ron Paul is saying exactly what the United Nations is saying, isn't he? Under the Law of War and Human Rights. Isn't that amazing? But nobody will bring that up. Nobody will bring up a national bank is unconstitutional. Nobody will bring any of that up. We're going to act like that don't exist. Okay? All right. Now, so here you go for all the historians like Jonesy and everybody else. I'm just going to take my hand and slap it across your face and tell you how full of shit you are. And you don't have a right to speak because you're a child if you're not going to do the work. All right? It hesitated, tottered, and fell as it did in 1815 under Mr. Madison and his bank, and in 1833 under General Jackson with his proclamation, and in 1848 under Mr. Van Buren with his free soilism, but with a fall far more terrible in its ruin than that of all the others combined. Its baser elements, of course, rushed to swell the tide of power. A vast proportion of its members joined with the Consolidationists to kill their party, and the Constitution and liberty itself by the war. Now, let me throw in again Bernie Mandeville, 1705, over and over and over again. Standing now amidst the wrecks of the contest, will not the Democratic Party at length learn wisdom from its terrible experience, and turn for a resurrection to a nobler life, to those great principles which formed it originally, and which alone can give it renewed vitality, and save the country? It will not be enough that the Consolidationists shall be overthrown from the unpopularity of their profligacy and tyrannies. The Democratic Party, to perpetuate the power over them, must place itself in a rightful antagonism upon the eternal principles of free government developed in the Constitution of the United States.